Hello everyone, this is Dr. Jamie Bacon. I'm Education Officer with the Bermuda Zoological Society, and today I want to tell you why Bermuda is considered totally toxic. And I do mean totally, not totally. So in this picture, you'll see two baby toads. And toads are like people with two arms and two legs. So if you think two baby toads, there should be four arms between them. And you're right, there are. Except this toadlet only has one, while this toadlet actually has three. And if you're a scientist like me, that starts getting the little hairs on the back of your neck to stand up straight, because you know something is terribly wrong for this to happen. So let's find out what went wrong. So amphibians are, just as a little background, they include all the frogs. Now frogs generally have a moister skin, they're thinner in body, and they have longer limbs. And they include all the toads. So toads have thicker, stouter limbs, a little fatter body, and generally have warts. But they also include all the salamanders, and salamanders look like lizards, but they have no scales. And the special class of salamanders called newts, and something called caecilians that look like earthworms. What all amphibians have in common is that they go through metamorphosis from a larval stage to an adult stage. And they also have a thin, permeable skin, and that means that the skin takes in water as well as oxygen, and carbon dioxide can be released through the skin. Now, amphibians to scientists are like the canaries in the global coal mine. A coal mine, which is a shaft down into the ground, can have lots of toxic gases in it when the miners are using their picks to get out the coal. So the miners couldn't see these gases, or they couldn't smell them. And what they started to do was to take canaries down into the mines with them, because canaries or other birds are much more sensitive to toxic gases than people are. So they knew that if the canaries stopped singing and started to die, they better get out of the mine very quickly before they got very sick. So scientists think that amphibians are like our living indicators of environmental health, because they're going to be the first group of vertebrates, those animals like fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. But amphibians will be the first of these animals to show the effects of problems with the environment, because they're considered to be more sensitive. Many of them have part of their life cycle in water and part of their life cycle on land. And so far in Bermuda, our amphibians have been spot on. What we've first seen in our toads and whistling frogs, we've also found now in other species of vertebrates. So amphibians are giving us a report card on how well we're taking care of the environment. What are they telling us? Well, we have one group of whistling frogs that we can still see today, and it's almost getting warm enough for the males to start calling at night, where they're calling, ladies, over here, I have a great place for you to lay your eggs. So these are still abundant and widespread. They're found all over the island. And I think what is saving them is that they lay their eggs in moist soil or other moist places and not in the water. So here is an egg mass for the whistling frog that's in the bottom of a plant pot that was discovered when somebody was replanting their pots. And that's one of the favorite places for these little whistling frogs to lay their eggs. But we also had another species of whistling frog also introduced by accident in the late 1800s. And this species had a stable population when it was surveyed in the mid-1960s by David Wingate. It did seem to be confined to the moister areas of the central parishes, but it was doing quite well. However, we haven't seen this since 1994. The last two of its kind were seen in Paget Marsh. So far, we've already lost one of our three species. The third species is the cane toad, also known as the marine or giant toad. Bufo marinus was its first name, and now it's Rhinella marina. This was introduced to Bermuda on purpose. Captain Nathaniel Vesey went to British Guiana in 1885 and brought 24 back to control garden pests in his garden in Devonshire. Well, sure enough, they became extremely widespread and abundant through the island when they were surveyed back in the 1960s. However, by the 1990s, it was clear that their population was declining, and scientists were starting to write about it. Now, their Achilles heel appears to be that they have to lay their eggs in water. So this is an egg mass for cane toads, and their larval stage also has to develop as tadpoles in water. So imagine you were sent out to study toads in Bermuda. I deputized you and said, all right, go see the toads and tell us what they're saying about our environmental health. So out you went, and this is what you found. You found the adults that you saw. The pelvis and backbone could be extremely abnormal. It could be bent. Occasionally you found the jaws were malformed, but mostly you found that their feet were in terrible shape. This one's missing a little bone at the end. You've got 2 little tiny toes here and extra toes, missing toes, toes that are fused together. Any way a foot or a hand could be deformed, you were seeing it, until the part that even feet or hands were missing. But you also saw that their face had problems. You saw big bulging eyes with huge pupils, little tiny eyes that weren't working at all. And here's one: you often found that the pupils were malformed. The iris should go all the way around the eye, so that one's malformed, and this one doesn't even have the top of the iris. But this toad actually has its eye pad, a third one, growing on its snout, where there should only be nostrils. Here, there's the lens that should be behind the pupil. This is 2 animals on top of each other, and the lens is coming through to the front of the eye. But you may see that an eye is missing altogether, or the protective eye pads are missing. So how often did this occur? Well, we started looking back in 1999 and 2000. In the first year, we went to 27 different sites and found that 19% of the adults we saw were abnormal in some way, with some sites having up to 29%. Then we went back to between 10 and 13 of the same sites year after year. We actually went through 2011 and found that the range was between 24 and 30% deformed. Now, normal is like birth defects in humans, only 2 to 3%. So Bermuda, year after year, all the way down through 2011, was running at 10 times what could be considered normal. So let's look at toad reproduction, because this is where it's happening. So the female is ready to lay eggs, and a male will grasp her in what's called amplexus. And that's going to help her get ready to lay a whole bunch of eggs. So she will find a suitable body of water. It doesn't have to be very deep. And she will lay those strings of eggs, between 8,000 and 30,000 of them. And while she's doing that, he's releasing the sperm, and the eggs are fertilized in the water. At some sites, however, there are maybe 9 males for every female. And if she's not careful, she's going to drown. So here's the poor female under here. There are 3 males on top, and here's a 4th that can't find a place to hang on. So, however, I have found at some ponds 25 females that were drowned because there were so many males. And this is the vulnerable stage. So depending on water temperature, it takes these tadpoles between 3 to 8 weeks to grow up and transform into toadlets. And during this time, if there are problems, pollution, as we'll find out, in the sediment and in the water, then they are going to be affected. So by the time they turn into these little tiny toadlets, they've already been affected by the problems in the water. So let's meet 2 deformed toads. I'm going to pause the recording for a minute, and bring out Maxine and Peter Pan. All right, so this is Maxine. Now, Maxine is female, like her name says, and you can tell the females because they have smoother skin and they have dark blotches. Maxine's a pretty dark female, but you'll see kind of a medium brown with dark blotches. Sorry, they also tend to pee. So they do have the poison glands. These are the poison glands here, but you don't see anything that looks like whipped cream. And that's because she's not secreting any poison. Toads are simply a defensive animal, and they'll only secrete poison when they're being attacked or really terrified. So what she is doing, though, is what most toads do in their first line of defense. Toads don't have any ribs, so they can inflate their lungs hugely, like beach balls. So she's inflating her lungs to look just as big as possible so that somebody or something will think that she is too big to bite. Now, she's holding her breath now, but people will say, oh, they're getting ready to spit because their throat moves in and out. That's not getting ready to spit. It's because since they don't have ribs and a diaphragm, they need to use their throat like a pump to get air in and out of their lungs. Now the little circles behind her eyes, those are her ears. So she does hear, and she's got big, beautiful golden eyes to be able to hunt at night. Now, of course, she doesn't just grab things with her mouth. She sticks out her tongue, and her tongue goes out to about there, very quickly. And if you've ever had a snail walk on your hand, you know it's kind of slimy and sticky. Well, the end of their tongue is slimy and sticky too. So her hands, though, are fine. But this foot, now let me just show you too. They drink through their skin and mostly this thin skin on their bellies. And that's why you may see them in your mom's flower pot soaking up the water. They're just coming for a drink. They don't have to be in water. They can just have moist ground or moist grass to get wet. So this foot, hold on a minute, Max. Right. This foot is almost normal, but this long toe here, it's missing a bone. So imagine your ring finger and just imagine one of the bones in the middle is missing. That's not bad. That's one of the most minor deformities. But her other foot, hold on, sweetheart. This foot is really only 3 toes. Put it up there. And she probably would have survived, but the toes are quite shortened and the foot is shortened. And that's because there was pollution where she was a tadpole. If you notice, she doesn't talk. She just sometimes lets out air and it sounds like she's hissing a little bit. But she's just fine. So we'll pause it and get out Peter. All right, this is Peter Pan. And he was named Peter Pan because he was the smallest toadlet. And I was wondering if he was ever going to get big. But he finally did. Now he and Maxine are both, they will be 8 years old this summer, I think. And the boys talk. So he's fun because he likes to tell stories, and especially about how pollution's affecting all his cousins. So, hold on, Peter. You can tell Peter is a male because they all look like females when they're littles, but as they grow, if they're male, they lose those blotches and they get all one color and they get this warty skin. And when they're about 2 years old, they start being able to chatter. So this is just a little chattering. They call it a release call. But it's not like the big mating call, which he does occasionally, which is very loud, especially at 2 in the morning. So you can see he's not going to swell up too much because he has a choice. He can either talk or swell up, but he can't do both. And you'd much prefer to talk. Okay, let me show them your feet. Okay, so hold on, Petey. Now this foot is perfectly normal. That's a great hopping and swimming foot, and the males have to be able to swim well. Hold on, honey. But this other leg sticks out to the side, and he has just this one, kind of a chunk of bone, and this one toe that sticks straight out. So poor Peter has to hop on his knee and his ankle. So Peter probably would have been eaten by the crows and the kiskadees and the yellow-crowned night herons that wait around the edge of ponds for the little toadlets to migrate away from the ponds. And they're a great snack at that point because they're not toxic. The eggs are toxic, the tadpoles are toxic, and the adults can be if they secrete poison, but not the toadlets. Well, I'm going to tell them the rest of the story so that they understand how we need to protect you guys. Just going to pause it again. So where on Bermuda was all this happening? We looked then at where toads were breeding. So this is Pittman's Pond, and that was that's down at the Long Bay Nature Reserve. It's one of the new pond there. And Seymour's Pond at Barnes Corner, Paget Marsh, Port Royal's ponds, which are freshwater. So what the toads need is to have almost totally fresh water to breed in. But they also were breeding in people's fountains, abandoned swimming pools, flooded fields, backyard ponds, anywhere that the water would stay for at least 8 weeks or so. Oh, so when we looked, we found that the toadlets had more problems than the adults. The adults were the survivors. We found feet that look like stars, so all this part of the foot is missing. Legs that hardly look like legs, it looks more like a pirate's leg. To missing parts of limbs, these toes are very short, but this one doesn't even have a foot, to where one or more limbs were missing. And occasionally we saw an extra arm. But one of the strangest things was, here is one with the left eye in the right spot, but the right eye, instead of growing on its face, grew on its back. And this one lived for about 8 days. I couldn't get it to eat, but sometimes it looked at me with this eye, and sometimes it looked at me with that eye. But we also saw problems on the golf courses too. So here's some that were from one Port Royal pond. They didn't have back legs. There were more than just one. There were some with just one leg or no legs. And at this stage, this is where they would need to get away from the pond, but these ones couldn't migrate. Also, there were times where the long bones in the legs were so short that they couldn't walk. This looks like a penguin from Happy Feet. The arms were also short and the jaws were malformed, so this one has to pull itself on its belly until it gets to the edge where it can pull itself up. At another place, another golf course, the snouts were shortened, the jaws were malformed, and the eyes were bigger. They made them look like Boston Terriers. Or another golf course, legs missing and funny, almost looks like a baby's arm for another leg. So we know that occasionally pesticides can be a problem. Well, why do we worry about deformities in toads anyway? Well, we have one of the highest reported cases ever recorded, and we have gotten international attention. I've been to several international conferences talking about Bermuda's problem, and we are among the worst in the world. In fact, in 2011, I looked at over 3,000 toadlets, and 20% were abnormal in some way. But the deformities are also just a red flag. They're warning us that toads and their environment may be in trouble. Now, could you imagine if 20% of our cats and dogs had deformed feet or limbs and were looking like this? So, I work with a toxicologist in Oklahoma. So I've been working with him since 2002. And how did we find the cause? Well, many laboratory studies. We used the sediment, which is the mud from the bottom of our ponds, and several species of frogs, as well as our cane toads. And what these studies showed was that pollution in the ponds, mostly in the sediments, was causing the deformities. So there were metals, and this is either from past dumping or input from roads and exhaust. And the metals we found caused facial defects, but also suppress the toad's immune system. And the immune system is what keeps them healthy in case we have a disease. So think about all these cars. We don't have quite these many lanes of cars, but as the cars are rolling around and hitting their brakes, they release a dusting of metal. And the metals get washed down the road drains, and often, here's just a PVC pipe, the pipes go directly or very close to ponds. But we also found that petroleum hydrocarbons, so these are the oily things in exhaust, the stuff that's on the roads from used motor oil, and that these cause the limb deformities, but also something called endocrine disruption. And that's where the pollution in the environment is disrupting the production of hormones. And we found that in female fish, in female toads, and in female terrapins, these are the pond turtles. Because of that, they couldn't produce enough estrogen, which had all sorts of effects. So here you can see there's Evans Pond is right over here. And so all we're doing is taking that road runoff and dumping it right down in this field so it can get in the pond. And we found here, this is an overview of Cloverdale Pond. This is the Collector's Hill gas station, the Collector's Hill apothecary. So we found that here in the sediments, if we looked at how much hydrocarbon was there, think of 4,000, and that was enough to cause huge effects. So we had these road drains, which collect the road runoff here, all cleaned out. And in 14 months, the grit that got collected in those soakaways, the contaminant level in that was 44,000. Now we actually were able to clean this pond using the bacteria and air to get rid of the hydrocarbons. But then we looked in the groundwater and we did samples through here, poking tubes into the ground, getting mud, and we found that the hydrocarbons that were in the soakaways were moving towards the pond. So even though we got this pond down to where we couldn't detect the hydrocarbons, it's only a matter of time to where it's going to be polluted again. And this is just to show one of the studies we did. This is a normal African clawed frog embryo. It's only 4 days old, and that's what it should look like. But if we put them exposed as they were growing up to sediment from Paget Marsh or Pittman's Pond or Seymour's Pond, they caused very severe deformities. And that was a first way of saying, okay, we've got a pollution problem. Now, a lot of people don't care about toads, so what about protected species like killifish and diamondback terrapins? We looked at killifish, and because killifish is protected, we also looked at mosquito fish, which are the fish that we put in ponds on purpose to eat mosquito larvae, and we checked them for deformities. And sure enough, at 5 different sites, up to 81% of the killifish had some type of deformity, and up to 60% of the mosquito fish at 6 sites. So here's an example. This is a normal mouth for a killifish, and this is what the jaws should look like. At some pond, the jaws look like it had been pinched, and then this has been pushed in. So this is the normal of this animal's mouth, going around with his mouth partially opened. And this is an adult. We found too much cartilage on lower jaws or too little cartilage so that the teeth you can barely see here were much taller. Bent backbones, So mouth, head, jaws, eyes, gills, and fins were all involved. We also looked at the Diamondback Terrapins. Now, this is a protected pond terrapin. They all live on the mid-ocean golf course, and they lay their eggs in the sand traps or wherever they can find sand. And we found only 4 to 20% of these eggs were hatching. At most in the lab were 40%, where it should be at least 80%. So looking inside the eggs, found all sorts of metals and hydrocarbons that were passed into the eggs from the mom, because the mom eats these hydrocarbons and metals in the sediment. And the embryos were so deformed that they just couldn't hatch. So it is not just an amphibian problem, it's also with our protected pond species. Now, those oil and gas pollution is making the female red-eared sliders look like males. My toxicologist friend, he said, send me 5 males and 5 females from 2 ponds. So this is what a female looks like. They've got short claws and a little bitty tail. And this is what a normal male looks like. Long claws and a longer, thicker tail. So I sent 5 that looked like this and 5 that looked like this. That was from that same pond I showed you the overview of. He came back and said, you sent me 8 females from Cloverdale. I said, no. But it turns out that these ones on the right that looked very much like males were actually females. But the hydrocarbons, all that oil and gasoline that was in the pond, made the developing little slider develop male characteristics, even though it was a female. Now with the toads, the females, it's very clear what's a female with the smoother skin and the dark blotches, and what's a male. Now as they're growing up and they go through the stage, they lose their blotches and they become this kind of warty golden color. But occasionally they get stuck in this halfway part. Or what I would find is that there were ones with smooth skin, tiny blotches, but the golden color of a male. So when I went out to do my surveys, I had to have 3 groupings. One for females, one for males, and one for unknown, that I couldn't tell what sex they were. So what can we do? How can we help things? How can we help our environment? Well, one of the first things is to make sure people don't dump used motor oil on the ground, because we know that's very toxic and it doesn't go away. People used to dump it on the ground in oil pits, and it wasn't until 1991 that we officially required that people recycle their motor oil. So in 1989, if each car just had 1 5-quart oil change, that would have been over 95,000 quarts of oil dumped on the ground. And we can try and get more electric vehicles used on the island and reduce our fossil fuel consumption and all the things, the pollutants that are in road runoff. And we can try not to dump anything in the ponds or on toads. Don't put salt or bleach on them because they are so important. And use the least toxic pesticides possible in the yards and on golf courses because their skin is so permeable. And we can create more ponds for toads to breed in so they can control the centipedes and cockroaches. St. David's Primary School had so many centipedes back in the 70s that they could count on a student getting bit every week. And if you talk to people in St. David's and St. George's, they'll tell you all about centipedes in their closets, on their pillows. So David Wingate helped them create a pond, and they had a population of toads, and they haven't had a single bite since. However, now they've filled in or closed off the pond so the toads can't breed there anymore, and it's just a matter of time. In fact, because we have so fewer toads now than we used to have, centipedes are now at Francis Patton School, they're at Shelley Bay, they've been seen across from Gorham's, they're at the West End. So centipedes are moving because we don't have our toads to take care of them. So one of the things we can do is make more places for toads to breed, and they can control the centipedes and cockroaches. So I hope you've learned something from this. Toads are our friends. They have personalities. They can learn. This is Freddie. Freddie had 3 arms. Freddie lived for 11 years. He spent 9 of those years talking to school kids, like the very first toad down below here, who's Stewie, a one-eyed female. The toads like Freddie, Stewie, Maxine, Peter Pan have talked to tens of thousands of school children. And hopefully, one day we will make the pond safe enough so that we don't have to keep talking to Bermuda's residents to try and fix the problem. It will all be fixed. Thank you for listening.